This video is sponsored by Raycon. More on them later.
Do you know how many mistakes I make on a daily basis? Oh, so many. So I was supposed to have scrambled egg on toast for breakfast this morning, but I forgot to buy any bread. So literally, first thing in the morning, straight out of bed, I'm already making some pretty big mistakes. And now I'm here making this video about all the mistakes that the Nintendo have made in the past. And I bet nobody over there forgot to buy bread. You know? They probably made bigger mistakes and lost more money though.
Apparently I only exist in this world to talk about the things that video game companies have done wrong, either recently or many years in the past. Last week I burned some bridges by talking about some of the worst game companies around today, and it wasn't that long ago that I was diving in on terrible video game consoles, so clearly I've found my holding pattern and I get a little too much joy out of highlighting some of the mistakes that companies have made. Nintendo are interesting because the highlights of their 40 plus years in the video game industry are some of the best moments the industry has ever seen, and so there's a strange humanizing quality to seeing them screw up so badly and do things that just leave you a little gobsmacked that this decision was made by the same guys who've done so much good. Personally, I prefer to surround myself with the products of more reliable companies, and so I'm pleased to say this video is sponsored by Raycon and their premium brand of high quality wireless earbuds. I've had a Raycon in my life for a good 3 years now, and basically every time I leave the house or do some cleaning in the house, you'll find me jamming out with my Raycons in. I've never felt the need to look elsewhere for alternatives since the sound quality is so crystally clear that it feels like I'm in the crowd at a concert, which is handy since the earbuds fit so well in my ear with optimized gel tips for the perfect in-ear fit that no amount of shaking will dislodge them, which is always very helpful. Raycon earbuds are water resistant and will survive being left out in the rain or dropped in a puddle by accident. They start at half the price of other premium audio brands but sound just as good if not better than other competitors, and since they come in 5 stylish colours you can be sure that they'll suit whatever style you're going for. With 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life, they can pump out a ton of music between charges so you won't be caught short without your music. Plus, Raycon is able to do all of this not only without wires for the earbuds, but also for the charging for some truly wireless charging. I just don't like cables. If this all sounds good and you fancy getting your ears on Raycon's everyday earbuds that now have over 49,000 5-star reviews, there's a way to do this which also supports my channel. You can go to buyraycon.com/rabbid or click the link in the description to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. That's buyraycon.com/rabbid to get 15% off your new earbuds. Thank you again to Raycon for sponsoring this video.
Anyway, Nintendo gotta do stupid things.
No idea where to start, but if you had to choose a particularly tricky period in Nintendo's history, you could do a lot worse, better, than pick the 1990s. Obviously not the whole decade, since they did some fine work with the SNES, but I don't know if it was the pressure of having Sega breathing down their necks or having to adapt to strange new technology, but Nintendo made a lot of mistakes this decade. One of the more resonant slip-ups can be found with the N64, a console full of iconic, incredibly important video games, but also a piece of tech that Nintendo didn't really know what to do with. It all stems back to their confidence that cartridges was still the best way of housing a video game, since the load times would be shorter, and Nintendo were worried about piracy with CDs, which they believed cartridges would help to prevent. And you know what? If they were in the games market on their own without the PlayStation showing everyone exactly what the future will look like with all its fancy discs, then we wouldn't have any problems with the N64 cartridges at all. Despite the data being easier to load, you couldn't store a lot on it, with the cartridges only able to hold 64 megabytes. By contrast, the CDs that the PS1 was flexing with could hold 700 megabytes, and of course, several PS1 games spanned multiple discs, so at least in theory, you could develop much larger games for the PS1 than you could ever imagine on the N64. And in a generation where everyone was pivoting to fancy 3D environments with cutscenes and full motion video, more space is quite the asset. Sensing that they were losing, Nintendo attempted to course correct with the N64. Now, obviously the GameCube had discs, but shrunk them down in an attempt to prevent piracy again. But you may also know that before the GameCube, Nintendo tried to keep the N64 afloat by implementing disk storage into it by way of an add-on. The N64 disk drive, or N64DD, had a lot going for it to be fair, including a dedicated online service that could connect a game to the internet. They hadn't quite worked out how to charge out the arse for the privilege yet. A real-time clock for a more dynamic game world, as well as just generally having more space for game assets. Not a lot though, only another 64 megabytes, so we're still some way down on a CD's capacity, and even with all the 64DD's funky new features, it used writable magnetic discs instead of conventional CD-ROMs, and when the DD came out in 1998, the world had firmly moved on to CDs. No one really cared when the DD came out in Japan, and so after a mere 15,000 copies sold, Nintendo cut their losses and shut the whole thing down. Games that were being developed with the DD in mind were either cancelled, squished onto the N64 as best as they could, like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or kept on ice until the GameCube came around, like Resident Evil 0. So, in the end, a lot of postulating and hedging your bets against the popular media, only to end up embracing it anyway. But for everything you can say about the N64, you can't really call it a failure. Yeah, sure, they lost ground to Sony and entered into a bit of a downward spiral that they wouldn't come back from until they decided to play their own game when the Wii came out, but the games were really good and the tech was understandable enough that plenty of developers wanted to and were successfully able to create games for it. The same cannot be said for the Virtual Boy, which is a chapter of Nintendo's history that I'm going to skim over a little, because I feel like I've talked about it a lot in videos like this one and that one. Go watch them, they're really good. Basically, Nintendo have always had half an eye on the next great innovation that can help launch a games console on an entirely new path. But for every Wii and Switch, there's the Virtual Boy, chilling out in some bizarre corner of Nintendo's history like an uncle who did time for assaulting Jehovah's Witnesses. Not sure what's the worst crime, to be honest, but giving kids headaches is... yeah, don't do that. This is Nintendo jumping the gun way too soon. Stereoscopic 3D would eventually have its day in the video game industry when the 3DS came around, but it was sorely in need of more time in the oven, and obviously it didn't get it. A cool idea for a games console that acts almost as like the ancestor to VR headsets, but the technology wasn't anywhere near good enough to do the concept justice in 1995, and since Nintendo refused to give it too much dev time, it ended up being a bad version of fledgling technology. It feels like a strange decision to pursue a new type of console just a year before the N64 came out, which is either a sign that they didn't have much faith in the N64 and wanted something else that might turn heads, or the other way round. That they knew the Virtual Boy was crap and needed something better to follow it up with. Imagine if the Virtual Boy wasn't terrible and Nintendo had two competent game consoles releasing in consecutive years. That's just crowding the market at that point. The underlying theme of most of what I've talked about thus far comes back to probably Nintendo's biggest ever mistake. Like, the Virtual Boy wasn't too damaging in the long run, and Nintendo eventually figured out how to use proper CD storage, at least for a few generations. But if you asked any die-hard Nintendo supporter or a higher up in the company what one mistake they'd fix from Nintendo's past, I reckon most of them would talk about Nintendo's botched deal with Sony in 1991. If that feels like a long time ago, it is. It was 31 years ago, but it should feel longer because Nintendo and Sony were striking up a deal that obviously predates any console that Sony would go on to create in the video game industry. In fact, that was Nintendo's primary reason for choking the life out of a deal that had already been in place for 2 years and had already created a prototype version of the SNES with an inbuilt CD drive. Yeah, no one has talked about CDs as much as this for about 15 years. But the stars were beginning to align for CD technology to house 3D graphics, and Nintendo were hoping to use Sony's expertise to help them in the market. Conversely, Sony were hoping to use Nintendo's knowledge of consoles to squeeze into the market themselves as a standalone console manufacturer. And with Nintendo sensing this, they drew first blood and threw Sony under the bus almost literally the day after the announcement. Like, fuck, that's cold. I can understand Nintendo's decision, but it feels weird to have such a knee-jerk reaction to the possibility of Sony encroaching on Nintendo's turf. Like, maybe there was a way of hashing this out in a legal room without going so public in a way that blows up spectacularly in your face, and actually motivated Sony to do the one thing you feared the most. I can't imagine it working out worse for Nintendo, and yet they managed it. Because while Sony were living their best life with the PS1 and tearing up the market, Nintendo were left to look in the direction of Dutch company Philips in the hope that they can help glue together the debris of the broken deal, and so the Philips CDI became a thing. This technology existed before Nintendo got involved, but Nintendo's involvement allowed Philips to use some of their licenses and say what you want about this console and some of the games on it, but you'd have to do some serious searching to find someone associated with Nintendo who isn't embarrassed that there's a Mario game out there that looks like this, and there's a couple of Zelda games where Link talks and he sounds like,
golly!
Between this in 1993 and the Virtual Boy in 1995, that's a hell of a time to follow Nintendo, oh my god. As it is nowadays, to be fair, albeit for a more positive reason, although the days of Nintendo kicking ass with the Switch seemed very far away when the Wii U was in full flow. Again, I've mentioned this thing recently, so I'll be brief, but basically, you can't have a console as successful as the Wii and expect that to happen again. Not quite a flash in the pan, but it was a more casual console that honed in on the right market with the right sort of games and the right approach to its control scheme, with the motion controls being more accessible for gamers of all ages. Fantastic! Well done, Nintendo, but the Wii U is trying to be that brand recognition without fully understanding what works so well with the Wii, and since the Wii U didn't do enough to separate itself from the Wii, it ended up seeming like some kind of add-on or a peripheral rather than a brand new console. The marketing was a car crash from start to finish that failed to capture the public's imagination in the same way as the Wii did. There's a bunch of different factors at play here, and you can't rule out that the public were a little fatigued with the Wii brand, but that's also indicative of a wider issue that the Wii U is somehow both too closely related to its bigger, more successful brother, to the point of being confusing, and yet not closely enough to write off much of the brand recognition. It's also a little bit of a sad sack of a console that, yes, did have some unique ideas of its own, but mostly occupies the same space as the Wii, but now with a big touchscreen tablet controller thingy. The Wii U is a lot of things to a lot of people, but it isn't a confident console. It's not entirely sure of itself and unable to market itself as doing any one thing properly. Any decent sales figures were hard carried by some of the games on the system, but even they couldn't help lift the Wii U out of the mud. The Switch has sold nearly 8 times as many copies as the Wii U, and it ain't even finished yet. It's not a bad recovery, all things considered. Anyway, I want to end off this video by talking about a scenario that is so strange you'd never expect to see it again. You really can trace most of Nintendo's darkest moments back to the 90s, and while that decade very clearly wasn't terminal for Nintendo's hopes of continuing to create more video games, they did some seriously weird shit in that time. This last one is special though, because technically Nintendo didn't make it, but they did give Leitmotiv enough creative license to make a live-action film based on Super Mario Bros. Oh yeah, we're doing this now, and while I'd consider myself one of the many people out there who fucking adore this film and see it as a product of its time and apparently very indicative of where Nintendo were in the 90s, it doesn't make for great cinema. You know, Martin Scorsese's over here all disappointed that Super Mario Bros. Was such a big letdown and nowhere near as good as Morbius, baby! Ain't got nothing on these numbers! So yeah, the Super Mario Bros. Film wasn't very good. That's my latest lukewarm take on YouTube.com. Make sure you like and subscribe. But I'm looking at it as less of a film and more as a method of putting Mario's name out there in the wider world, beyond the restrictions of a video game. Arguably, Mario didn't need the extra publicity since he was riding off the back of 3 awesome NES games, an arcade game, and some tasty spin-offs, but I can see the logic behind looking for other revenue streams that could have paid out handsomely for Nintendo. The issues arrive in giving those involved in making Super Mario Bros. The movie a ton of creative freedom. Clearly too much freedom, since Bowser looking like a regular guy with hair gel isn't something I thought I'd ever see, and don't even get me started on the Goombas. What the hell happened to you guys? Fun and goofy, yes, but Nintendo giving up the reins to Mario was one hell of a mistake, and clearly someone at Nintendo remembers. You may remember that there's another Mario movie coming next year. Lessons were learned though, since it's animated instead of live action, although it is being made by the same people who created Banana. So maybe we're not completely out of the woods yet. The encouraging thing is that Shigeru Miyamoto is in active dialogue with producer Chris Meledandri and decided to delay the film until 2023, but the delay doesn't encourage me as much as it should. Like, did Nintendo make that decision because the film isn't up to scratch, or are they just delaying the inevitable? What kind of fresh hell awaits us? I don't know, but I'm undecided if Chris Pratt speaking normally or with an Italian accent is worse. I'm not worried, I'm just braced.
But hey, maybe the Mario movie will actually be pretty great. You know, when the live action film came out in 1993, it seemed to kick off this chain of events where all the video game movies were terrible. But nowadays, like, Detective Pikachu was really good, I enjoyed Mortal Kombat, and you know, Sonic's got his own little franchise over there, so maybe it'll actually be really good. But none of those movies had Keegan-Michael Key as Toad, though. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like and subscribe for more in the future. And if you want to watch around right here, there's a video here where I ranked all of Nintendo's consoles from worst to best. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Scott Riker, Christopher Robinson, and Sarah Mallion. Thank you for watching, and please don't paint the Goombas yellow.